Quick reminder to sign in at the front if you haven't already. A few remarks. There's a professional development certificate that you can get if you attend 5 of these events and fill out the survey. The next event is tomorrow from 2 to 3 in the Leadership Studies Town Hall. This is from stress to success. It'll be a panel of graduate students talking about health, mental health specifically. With that, I will turn it over to Miss Teresa.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know we have a small knit group today, but I'm actually kind of happy with that. I'm hopeful that throughout our conversation today, you'll be able to get opportunities in multiple places for more personalized feedback or an opportunity to chat through some of the particular questions about the research you're working on. So I think that's great. I will warn you that at some point a little bit later, it would likely be a little easier for you to follow along if you move a little closer to the front. Do we want to just get that out of the way right now? Would you guys mind to come in a little bit closer? I'm always the person who sits in the back, so I get it. But if you want to fill up maybe even these 2 rows here, I think you'll be able to see a little bit more of what we're going to take a look at later. I appreciate it. Thank you. That way too, when we chat a little bit more about some of the details, we'll just be able to see a little bit better. Okay. How many of you are doing a poster, in the near future for the first time? Show of hands. Okay. How many of you have a poster session that's coming up in the next couple of months? Okay. Which is assume, presumably why you're here, which is good. I like to just kind of get a sense of what's happening. A little bit about me. I am an instructor in the English department and one of the assistant directors of the Writing Center. This is my research area. I love talking about poster design. And I think it's a field that we kind of forget about, but is also evolving in the same way that other research is. So we're going to talk a lot today about some traditional methods for poster design, but also some innovative ones that have been as recent as the past year. And hopefully you'll find something in here that you feel will fit your research ideas and fit your profession and your field. A quick little rundown of what we're going to cover today. I want to focus in on kind of the most important components of, thinking about the context of a research poster, which is analyzing the audience, because it's a unique one in the research field. And then given your audience, crafting the message that matters is what will get you started in this process, but also the way that your poster will be successful. With that, I have some general tips to help you begin preparing your research for academic viewing. So typical types of conferences, but also conferences similar to the ones coming up, like the Research in the State. You'll have a lot of audiences who are not academics, but are invested in the topics you're talking about. So we'll talk a little bit about how to handle that. And then we will end with some general guidance for putting a poster together. So some design tips and tricks and some examples we'll take a look at, which is why I had you come a little bit closer. Okay. I'm going to start off with some visuals. Just to get you moving, I would like you to take a look at this image. This is an infographic. I would like you I'm going to give you maybe 30 seconds to take a look at it. Tell me what the main takeaway of this image is. So have a look. So if you were passing by this image, because this is kind of the context in which it was created for, what would you say is the main message you're supposed to derive from this image? Mhm. Perfect. So light rail is more cost effective than a subway expansion. Now, how is the visual design of the image sort of crafting that message for you? Whether it's, the argument you side with or not. How is the image itself kind of helping you lean in one direction? Mhm. Yeah, so setting two things side by side, that in itself allows you to make really direct comparisons between what you see on one side, what you see on the other. So that was a deliberate design choice. What else do you see? Mhm. Yes. Yeah, so just the choice to make these the largest things in the image was a choice. If you're passing by, you see the massive difference in cost in terms of the numbers they display to you. You see a really big comparison being made. You also see the population or the numbers of people being served on at the bottom. So that, in addition to just being able to see a lot going on the left-hand side versus what's going on the right, is meant to send you the message that if you had to take your pick, light rail is better. Now, what about the design is also preventing you from seeing kind of the other side of the argument, or preventing you from seeing details that might also be relevant to this discussion? Do you notice anything? To put it a different way, what is the visual not emphasizing? Total cost. Yeah. So it's in smaller font deliberately. The cost that they are giving you is the cost per kilometer, because we're Canadians and we like the metric system, but also because that is the number that works best for this argument. Cost per kilometer, the unit actually looks smaller, but when you think about it, and you see all of the proposed lines that would go in with this light rail system, the actual total cost is much different than 111 million, and in fact would make it a lot more expensive. So it's not that the information isn't there, it's just that the visual is de-emphasizing those components of the message. Some other things to pay attention to, because I think given even where you're sitting, you might not be seeing some of these details. This number down at the bottom is referring to Torontonians served, but the way they're defining that is written down in gray just under here. You can't even really see it. But that's referring to the number of people living and working within a 6-minute walk or 500 meters of the proposed lines. So it's an interesting way to capture the number of people that would be impacted by this type of system, light rail versus subway. It makes a lot of sense for light rail because people tend to live fairly close to lines that kind of move outside of their homes. Subway lines, people sometimes live close to the stations, but a large portion of users are people who commute from the outer perimeters of metro areas, park at the nearest kind of perimeter station, and commute into the city. So that number is missing a huge number of people who might be impacted by a subway expansion. So what I want to emphasize here is that the visual is not, inaccurate. It is not presenting an argument that is false necessarily, but the people who put this image out wanted you to pay attention to certain details and not others. Now compare that to this one. What's the message of this image, this visual? Yeah. Now, what you're seeing here is set up sort of the silhouette images of the subway systems in each of these cities. So visually speaking, it makes Toronto look like it's seriously lacking. So this was put out by people who wanted the citizens to vote in favor of a subway system. So effectively, it gives you a really clear picture of why we're missing something that we might want. This visual is also preventing you from seeing certain things as well. Things like scale, population comparisons, all things that might matter when you're actually thinking about how a system might be set up and used by each of these cities, which are all very different. So again, not necessarily preventing you from learning that information, but it's not the emphasis of the visual. So these two images were put up in public spaces in the city. So like the sides of bus stops, subway stations. You're meant to walk by the image and not really stop and look at it too closely. And so the visual design is there to convey a message quickly and efficiently. And visuals have a lot of power to persuade, depending on how you place things, how you organize things, where you kind of choose to put your emphasis. So that's the context I want you to consider as we move into a discussion of posters, that this is one of the few mediums in research that really emphasizes the power of visual persuasion. And it's a nice, efficient way for you to convey ideas that are often bogged down in lots and lots and lots of research papers, lots of data, things that are not necessarily accessible in the same way to an average reader, to an average audience member. Things that, they could eventually take closer look at, but a poster allows people to get research information very quickly. And it's the visuals that play one of the biggest roles in that. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we get started with posters and kind of thinking a little bit about the context that we design these posters for, particularly our audience. So attendees at conferences where these poster sessions happen, as you know, I'm sure, is a very wide range of people. You'll have fellow graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, as well as some of the top researchers in the particular field. So it's a place where we can really gather. And poster sessions are often that opportunity to really see a good mixing of all different representations of research at work. The things you need to keep in mind is that because you have such a broad audience, your research moment is a little bit more of a challenge. That unlike presenting a paper in a session at a conference where people will see the topic ahead of time and likely have an interest in it, so they will go into the session usually with a little bit of background information, poster sessions are often attended by people who have a very, very kind of different interest or research area than you. So you're speaking to people often outside your field, outside your area of expertise. And because of that, the type of information that you put on your poster has to change. So we always ask people we counsel in the Writing Center when they're getting started in their posters to start asking these types of questions. Asking about your audience, how much will they already know ahead of time about your field and your discipline? There will be people who know a lot. There'll be experts in your field attending that poster session, but there might be people who know nothing. How do you cater to those two very, very different types of readers? And then even more specifically, how much do those people know about your topic? Because that will also vary widely. I'm guessing that that number of people who are familiar with your field versus the number of people familiar with your topic is very different. It's a much smaller number. But the number of attendees at a session is going to be a much larger number. So you have to balance that out. One of the big messages that you want to consider right off the bat is, what does your audience need to learn by the time they finish reading your poster? And of that information, what's going to be new? Related to that, you would ask maybe, what action are you encouraging as a result of your research, generally speaking, but what particular actions might the poster be prompting people to do? That can be more abstract things like thinking differently about a topic, because your research is pushing that idea in different directions. But it could also be very direct actions in regards to funding, more testing, more research in the things that you're advocating for. But you need to be clear as to what those actions are. The answers, as you can imagine, are going to vary depending on sort of where and how you're communicating your research, but it's important to be aware of how the audience shifts a lot. So the poster or the research you might have had practice preparing in your department seminars in front of your colleagues is going to be different than taking your research to a national convention. So being aware of those differences is a good place to start. Related to that is crafting your message. That given all these questions, you have to figure out what am I going to say about this research I've been conducting for months or years or many, many years for some researchers. It's important to be able to think about how you would tell other people about the importance of what you're doing. So with this in mind, I'm asking you to turn to somebody near you and try to explain to that person why your research matters. So it could have something to do with the findings are really important, the methodology is really cool, the theory is really interesting and hasn't been figured out before. Whatever you feel is important about your research. The challenge, though, here is that you're going to have to do this in one sentence. So give it a thought for a second and then find somebody you can tell this to and try and keep yourself to that one sentence or less if you can. Give it a try. I know. Okay, how did that feel? It's tricky. I'll say right off the bat, this is advice that I find I tell a lot of people kind of crafting their research, whether it be posters, whether it be general presentations, whether it be prepping their research papers. This type of exercise really forces you to think about what matters and helps you to condense kind of all the various things you're doing into the ideas that will matter the most to those who are listening to you. So it's something I'm going to encourage you to try multiple times in your planning stages. Can you craft the key idea, the key important message in a sentence or less? So that's kind of the first tip of this whole session. Related to that, just to kind of recap why this is important, is remembering that posters are there to distill research and to communicate what matters most. And so that could, vary depending on what you do. That sometimes it's about findings, what you discover that is different and important and that matters and that has impacts. Others are exploring innovative methodology that hasn't been tried before or is being done in a new way. A lot of times, visualizing your data is really important. This is one of the first times, perhaps, that you have had a chance to show people what your data looks like. And so that's what posters are there for. To pull from NSF, broader impacts matter. Basically, telling other people why we should fund researchers like you. Why what you do matters to other communities is really important. And then thinking about future implications, because a lot of posters prompt networking and further research that you will conduct, or perhaps you and other people can conduct. So just to kind of share some success stories, posters often prompt you to form collaborations with people, which is really nice. It's a great way to ask people who are leaders in your field to be introduced to your work. Because oftentimes, you can send out papers for these people to read, but they get that kind of stuff all the time. They often have a lot of stuff to do themselves and are not very likely to respond with a lot of feedback. However, I've emailed people ahead of a poster session and said, hey, I'm presenting on this. I know this is something you're interested in. I'd love it if you would stop by. It doesn't always work, but I've had a few successful conversations with people where they'll come and take a look, and they're happy to do so because it's a much easier time investment for those researchers to come and take a look. My husband's also a researcher here on campus. He invited one of the top people in his field to take a look at his poster a few years ago. They're now co-authors. And so it was a really great moment for him to be introduced to people. So this is why this is so important. Even though I think poster sessions are often considered like the bottom of the barrel in terms of opportunity, I really think they can do a lot of good. So with that in mind, the thing you always have to remember is that posters are not there to communicate the entirety of your work. They are not visual versions of a paper you're writing, in that they're kind of capturing every single component and paragraph in detail. I've seen some posters that do just that. They basically copy and paste their intros from their papers, put it on the poster. They copy and paste discussions and results and just put it on the poster. But we're dealing with a different medium for a reason. And so you want to think very carefully about the important things that matter to your audience. Okay. With these general kind of goals of posters in mind, I wanted to walk you first through some practical tips. They're going to cover kind of a wide array of things to consider as you're planning your poster sessions. After that, we're going to take a look at some real examples, which is, I think, where we can have some good conversations. But just some things that might be helpful is that as you begin developing your posters, those of you trying to make your poster better for another session, you really have to keep this reading experience in mind and remember kind of just what it's like to be in one of those poster session rooms. Conferences, hallways, often you get stuck in these really cacophonous, large spaces, are really noisy. So noisy, not necessarily temperature controlled. Readers are standing around, sometimes they're passing by. You have a varying degree of interest among the people in the room. And so you're kind of that person who's trying to get the attention of those who would come and take a closer look. You don't always talk to the people who read your poster. That's another thing to keep in mind, especially if your research is getting a lot of traction. If you have multiple people kind of listening and taking a look at a time, you're sometimes just talking to one person while another one takes a look. So your poster needs to be able to stand on its own in that context. As you start beginning to plan your content, keep some of these overarching goals in mind. Try and organize around something centralized, whether it be a theme, your thesis, your finding, or that overarching message. So I usually encourage writers to map out kind of link every kind of choice of content back to that main message in some way. Something really practical, something I didn't consider the first couple of times I did posters, was just making sure you know what your space is going to be. That the physical space of your poster can make a difference and can cause a lot of confusion and anxiety if you're not prepared. So know the dimensions that you have available to you. Know the materials that you have, whether it'll be a board where you can put things up or if you're expected to bring a lot of that stuff. Know what the space might look like. Conference organizers and people who attend similar conferences each year are always happy to provide this to you. So if it's not readily available, you can certainly ask and know that others have been asking ahead of you. You want to begin choosing visuals from your research or maybe newly crafted visuals that will do the job of emphasizing your message. So a lot of researchers will bring sort of key visualizations of their data, things that are coming out of other components of their work, but oftentimes you have to create something new so that it'll work for this particular context. You want to be prepared for that. Other things that posters should be doing well is representing the relationships of ideas as visually as possible. So getting comfortable with using the design to help you with moving from one area of your poster to the next. So little things like arrows, the way you shape and design the flow of your text boxes, the way you organize and arrange columns. All of these things are meant to visually emphasize how your ideas are connected. So pay attention to that and ask people who are reviewing your poster to, kind of let you know when something doesn't make sense. Something that I'll repeat just because it's really important. Keep your audience knowledge in mind that sometimes you need to make space on your poster to provide explanations for things that will be obvious to you, not necessarily to your reader. So certain definitions are helpful sometimes, other kind of things that might make them unfamiliar and therefore less likely to be interested if they feel like it's very foreign to them. One of the big things, because I'm just one person kind of talking about generally speaking what posters do well, is just knowing what your field does. There are lots of posters across campus here where you can take a look at what people in your department have done. But asking your major professors, asking any mentors and fellow graduate students what they've heard about good posters is really helpful, because some fields have very specific kind of guidelines and expectations. And knowing what those are will kind of relieve any anxiety ahead of time. Utilize the templates. There's a lot of people that have thought of this and have figured out some easy kind of tips and tricks for design. Go for it. Don't feel like you have to build from scratch. That takes too much time, and it's often time you don't have because you're busy doing other things. So try and utilize when you can, and I'm going to show you a few really good ones as well. The title seems to be the thing that more than anything else people talk about, because it occupies the most prime piece of real estate on your poster. And so we tend to think about the titles last because, it's something we're so familiar with, but this is the opportunity to aim for a really accurate representation of what your research and findings are. And again, the titles tend to vary a lot by field and discipline. So knowing what titles look like in your profession, in your research area is really important. Okay. Then just a quick little comment about how you prep your poster while at the same time prepping your discussion, because you also want to be ready to talk when you have that really engaged reader. And so what I usually encourage is that you have several versions of your discussion ready to go. Something that pairs nicely with the poster, but doesn't just repeat what the poster shows you. It kind of adds to the conversation, offers more insight and information for that really invested reader. So I like the 30-second elevator pitch, 30 seconds or less. I also like having kind of a quick summary of your key findings and methods. Oftentimes experts in your field will ask you about those things because they're interested in the topic, they like the findings, but they know a lot more about how you go about your research, and therefore they want to know more about what you did and how. So I would prepare a discussion for that. And then for a general audience, being prepared to discuss broader impacts is really helpful because, again, your goal there is to attract the interest of people who are outside your research area, but who are impacted by your work and may want to learn more. Thinking a little bit ahead of time about questions that you might be asked, often, at least for me, eases a lot of the anxiety. That you don't feel like you have to think on the spot. There's a lot of questions you can anticipate. Ask your colleagues to throw some questions at you before you go because they'll often ask some of the same things you'll get. Being prepared that way will be really helpful. And then a general reminder, something I always have to remind myself of whenever I'm presenting in a public space, is just practicing to speak more slowly than you typically think you need to. Sound a little weird to yourself, but generally you're aiming for a nice flow of conversation that will happen while the adrenaline is kind of there and there's lots of people and things and stuff going on. So don't be afraid to pair these two discussions really well together. Plan the poster and the conversation at the same time because it helps to make sure that these two things go together. Okay. Couple of general discussions first about sort of what posters tend to look like in various professions and various research areas. First, we'll cover a lot of the hard sciences and engineering. Layered expectations, from what I can gather, are pretty much a little bit more rigid than others. You often see that 3 to 4 column style. You're meant to read top to bottom, left to right across the columns. This style typically follows the IMRAD structure, similar to your research papers. The information is data heavy because that's usually what you want to show people. That's what gets the attention. And so these types of posters tend to have a lot of tables, charts, and figures. You have some room to kind of play around with a design style, but I always caution that it's something you want to kind of check in about first. Ask some people in your field, what would happen if I designed a poster that looked like this? And sort of gauge the reactions you get. Because what I find is that these fields tend to be a little bit more formalized in terms of format. Now, posters in humanities, some social sciences, depending on which field you're coming from, these fields tend to work very similarly, but kind of generally speaking, there's a bit more room for creativity. So similar to formatting of science and engineering, you can follow that IMRAD structure, but you have the freedom to kind of work around the design and kind of pick something that's a bit more creative. And so in that sense, you might design around a particular theme. You might have a narrative or a visual metaphor that represents your work. And so that's pretty typical. And what you often see in posters in these types of fields are like photographs, a lot of primary research and evidence, infographics, visuals that form this narrative. In some cases, the design itself is very strongly tied to the research message, that what you're seeing is a visual representation of a concept or an idea. Okay. Do you have any questions at this point in time, kind of given all these tips and tricks? Have you been getting advice from people in your field about what good posters do and what bad posters do? What's some advice you've been given? I'm always curious sort of what people are kind of hearing before they come into this. Yeah. Right. Great. Yes, I like that idea, like thinking of it more as a tool rather than here's all the research that I throw up there. I think that is good advice. Yeah. Anything else you've been told either to do or not to do? Yeah. Yes, I've definitely had my vision tested after going to conference sessions because sometimes, yeah, the font can be very small. There are some good suggestions online if you want to aim for a font that tends to work best. What you want to think about is not the reader who is right up at the poster. You want to think about the readers who are over here in another section or walking by, because those are the readers you want to attract. The ones who are already interested in your topic are going to find you no matter what. And so it's really about engaging that person who's walking by. Yeah. Any other sort of comments or questions before we move into the next stuff? Okay, I want to start showing you some examples. So this is why I had you kind of come a little bit closer. What I'm going to first show you is a quick scan of multiple different styles. We're going to come back and take a closer look at each one, but I want you to just kind of look and react to what you see in a few seconds. So pay attention to what you pay attention to, and we'll talk about it, okay? So here's our first one. Kind of see what you can glean in a few seconds. Pay attention to the design, any questions that you have. By this point, you're probably walking by it already at the conference, so we're going to move to the next one. And here's another one. And another one. Okay, I think that's all of them. Anybody care to share either posters that really stood out to them or features they noticed in certain ones? Sort of, what was your reaction as we kind of did a quick scan of each one? Yeah. This one? Yeah. And the frog one. Sure. There's the other pretty visual one. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Similar, different reactions. Anything else you noticed? Yeah. Yes, that makes me happy. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Has anybody else seen this style pop up yet in your fields at conferences? Okay. This is good to know this is getting traction. This is new even since I gave this talk last year. So that's sort of to show you just how this kind of conversation is still kind of evolving. I think some really good points were brought up about the other ones too. I'm going to come back to this one. Let's start with this first one here. This is a good representation of the way a lot of posters have been done since like the 70s and 80s and 90s. Kind of follows a design where we like color, we like to have a good spattering and balance of images and text, but there are some challenges you want to keep in mind if you follow this type of structure. So this one I think is a good example of how background information can have a lot of impact, that I think if there was a blank background, you might find a lot of the information a little bit easier to grasp. So pay close attention to just the design scheme that you begin with. Oftentimes templates give you more than you need to, than you really need to have. And so I often encourage people to take away from the formatting rather than to add, especially if they're building off of a template. Some strengths of this poster design, though, is kind of a really quick and easy to follow structure. This is your nice traditional IMRAD structure. We can clearly find what we need, and everything is captured in point form so that, again, you don't have to read long paragraphs. You're going to kind of capture the most important information that people can process pretty quickly and efficiently. There's a good representation of research. The visualizations, I would say, are pretty accessible, and we can see the key findings fairly quickly. It's nice that conclusions are really easy to spot. We can kind of, even if we're interested in just looking at those takeaways, can very easily find them. So this one I like to show you. This was an award-winning poster at a national conference. So even though I would say that there are some challenges with it, it was still deemed effective by the organizers. So I thought it was worth showing you. Now, this next one, I think is kind of that similar traditional structure, but with some key differences that I wanted to point out. So anything that you noticed about this design that was a little bit different? Yes. Sure. So what we're talking about here is the font in or the blue font. So instead of traditional headings, intro, methods, discussion, results, things like that, this uses full kind of phrase conversations, sort of claims about what the content beneath it is kind of talking about. Has anybody seen this style used before? Yes. This is kind of an early version of that last poster we took a look at with the huge claim. This is coming out of engineering, actually, engineering research. And I'll talk about him in a little bit when I give you some more resources to take a look at. But Michael Alley is a mechanical engineer, now researcher in engineering communication. And what he found is that if you make a claim in a full sentence or a full phrase, rather than use headings just as kind of standardized descriptions of content, you usually get a bit more engagement. And this is something he's tried both on posters as well as in PowerPoint presentations. So he encourages the same thing to happen at the top of a PowerPoint slide. And he's studied the impact of this and says that people who read this retain information longer and they retain more of it. So I feel that's a really great way to kind of see how this information and the design can actually impact your audience. So some things to keep in mind about this setup, if you feel it's one that would fit your work, is that it still follows a pretty traditional 3-column style. This is something that works for a lot of different research areas. But the challenge then instead is that instead of talking about introduction, instead of talking about data, you really have to focus in on the claims and the implications of your work. You want what you put in your blue font, in this case here, to really matter and to draw in audience members who are part of your field, but also not part of it. So you want to choose language that is accessible, and you want to choose language that's representative of those broader impacts. You also want to make sure, though, that it also captures what the actual content is about, that it needs to match what's being elaborated on and discussed in the paragraphs or bullet lists that you choose to include. Now, some challenges of this poster design. Can anybody think of anything, or did anybody experience anything that they feel would be a little problematic on a poster? Sure. Yes, that's a really good point. And so without the traditional intro methods, discussion results, and conclusion headings, you're going to need to make sure that the flow of information is clear, because it's not necessarily easy to tell that we're meant to read column by column here. You can still kind of pinpoint things that matter to you and take a closer look, but the visual has to be very clear about sort of where you move from one thing to the next. And so that's why a column approach can work well, or you might want to visually represent kind of a movement from one thing to the next. The other thing about this design is that because it's using full sentences, both in the heading structure and in the content, you're asking people to do a lot of reading. And so you want to make sure that if those audience members who don't want to read, don't, the visuals will convey a lot of the important information, as well as just those headings and the title that you would choose to put at the top. So you want to appeal to those readers who are going to take a closer look because they're drawn in by what you've written in those headings, but you also want the headings to stand alone and be effective at conveying what you have to say. But I really like this strategy. I get all my students to do this because I teach a lot of engineers, and it seems to work really well. Okay. Now this one, how did you feel about this one? There's a lot of text. Now this is representative of an award-winning poster in a humanities conference. So just sort of the way it's set up kind of looks different from the other two, which are more hard science and engineering. This assumes a lot, though, that your reader is going to want to read every single thing that goes there. But the reason I think it was chosen as a strong poster at this particular conference was just the accessibility of the imagery that you have at the top, and the narrative that accompanies it. If you don't have time to read all of the details, kind of looking in at some of the figures they have can give you some good insight as to what they do. They also have a title that I think communicates the topic really clearly, so that I'm guessing that in this context, interested people will walk up and talk to that researcher about their work a little bit more. So it has its strengths, but you have to be prepared to account for all of the text, and not everybody's necessarily going to read it. But I did like to show it because I think some professions still like kind of a narrative style represented on their poster, and it seems to work in some fields. Okay. This one. This one was talked about fairly recently in a couple of discussions of more innovative poster design, that a lot of people who have a passion for design and illustration are trying to break out of that standard 3-column style and use the space for the imagery that matters to their professions and to their research areas. What I think is really strong about this is that it's limited in text. A lot of conferences are beginning to ask for like a word limit on posters, which I think is a good move, to be honest. We tend to put more words than we need to. So it allows the imagery to kind of convey the topic of interest, the field. The data and the visuals are still very much there and present and at the forefront. And then the writing that accompanies it is for those interested readers who will be drawn in. But I think just passing by, you get a good representation of the topic. And so not everybody has the time for this level of visualization, but if it's something that interests you, it's getting a lot of traction, particularly in the sciences, where we're really thinking hard about how to kind of work with design principles to communicate complex information. Anything else you noticed about this or wanted to ask about? Yeah. Sure. Mm-hmm. Any ideas as to why? Any good guesses? Well, yeah, that's probably true. Just to kind of allow that image to have its own space. My guess is that it's easier to process the details of the conclusion if you see the findings first. And so it's encouraging a flow of reading by putting it down at the bottom. That way you're not just reading the text and then maybe not even taking a close look at the visuals. Yeah, that's true. This is also a vertical design. Not a lot of conference spaces allow for this. So if it's something you're interested in, you might, again, need to check the dimensions. A lot of times the dimensions are specified in landscape rather than portrait mode. But I thought it was cool to take a look at. Nick Wu has been getting a lot of traction for his designs as well. He kind of works as a freelance illustrator for sciences and for poster sessions. So he's somebody who's very interested in kind of making sure that the visual beauty of posters is out there. So that's why I thought I'd show you this one. Okay, now on to this one. I'm glad to hear that it's something that people are familiar with. This is the new poster design of the last year, essentially. Mike Morrison, who is a PhD researcher at Michigan, I think. His field is organizational psychology. He got some attention on Twitter when he advocated for this new design. He basically said, old kind of conference posters are boring. They're left over from previous generations that didn't have access to the tools that we have, and they should be more about distilling information. And if the important thing to distill is the main message, why don't we make that super easy for people to see? Now, this is one version of his template that captures that really key message first. But what he also encourages is good visual evidence and data that people can take a closer look at. So it doesn't emphasize lots of text, which I think is good. In this particular context, the images are quite small and you have to take a very, very close look. But a lot of his design styles would accommodate you kind of making more room for bigger representations of the data that you're showing. So I'm going to talk about him in just a minute. Okay, so just to link you to some of these resources in terms of trying to find the type of design that works for you. One of my big recommendations, whether you're in engineering or not, is Michael Alley. He has a lot of really good resources on his website, and he makes templates available if you are interested in a design that really makes the claims of your research clear. It allows you to still follow a traditional format to kind of go through the IMRAD structure or to utilize the visual design of 3 or 4 columns, but it helps you to kind of make sure that the assertions you're making about your research are really easy for people to see. So he has lots of templates on his website. You can Google just Michael Alley and his website will come up. But I really like him, even if you are in a field outside of engineering or the sciences. Another resource I really like is Colin Purrington. He's been around for a while and he maintains a blog where he talks about some general tips and tricks. He's really good about trying to think about the practical details of poster sessions, just sort of capturing some of his conversation here. Basically, you know, conference sessions and poster sessions are like this really hot room where people have been, you know, they're eating their lunch, maybe they've been drinking. This is kind of the free-for-all of the conference, and you kind of have to work with it. And so I think he has some really good kind of humorous advice about how to handle that and how to make your ideas stand out. The other thing I like about him is that he also does work with a more traditional format, because a lot of you might be given the advice to stick with something that is fairly kind of standard looking, but he provides a really great template to help you think about the content that needs to go into that. So I find him really, really helpful. Okay, and here's Mike Morrison again. If you are on Twitter and check out the hashtag #BetterPoster, this is his movement. So this has been going on since earlier this year, when he posted a video on YouTube that got a lot of attention. Walks through kind of his reasoning for kind of trying to come up with a better design. I really like a lot of his suggestions, and though we don't have time for the video today, I'll just show you very quickly that what he does talk about kind of transforms a traditional style poster into something that he would advocate for. Just show you really quickly a couple of his things.
Sent me his poster and let me use it for the video. Thank you, Jacob. And you probably can't tell from this poster, but Jacob's study is actually really cool and important. But that coolness and that importance is lost in this traditional academic poster format. So we're going to take this and we're going to redesign it. And we're going to start by grabbing the main finding, the core takeaway of this study, and putting it on our blank poster. So let's see, what's the main finding of this study? What's the main finding? See, this is the problem I'm talking about. It's taken me way too damn long to find the main takeaway from this study, which is pretty representative of the problem here. And that has nothing to do with this poster. Every poster in science is like this. Okay, so after reading this entire poster, I think the main finding is this bit right here. We found consistent differential validity for some non-cognitive measures for predicting international student GPA, specifically with SJTs, continuous learning, social responsibility, and perseverance. So let's put that on the poster. And then we're going to change the background color. You can use your school's color if you want to, but I think it would be extra efficient to use colors that prime people's expectations about what type of poster they're about to see, because they'll notice the color first. Like we could use green for empirical studies because they're the most common, blue for theory, red for methods, and yellow, the most attention-getting color, for that rare and wonderful intervention study. So this is already better, but it sounds kind of technical to anybody who doesn't specialize in the subfield that this relates to, which is selection or hiring decisions.
So that's just a little taste of what he talks about. But he has a 20-minute video where he walks you through details about how to transform an old poster design into something that is crafted around a message, and how to work with a template to still utilize a lot of traditional features like data, charts, conversations about what goes into kind of the methods of your research, what your conclusions are, what your findings are. So I encourage you to check him out. Like I say, he is somebody who is getting a lot of attention from young researchers, but I think the good news is that his work is starting to kind of pick up. And I think he's a really good kind of practical practical presenter as well. And so if you check him out online, he offers templates for his style, and he provides different ways that you can kind of manipulate the visualization of that message and still allow for more space when you need it. So I think he's doing really cool things. And even though he's getting a little bit of kind of blowback from some researchers who are claiming, rightfully so, that his methods aren't tested yet, I think the fact that people notice these posters in these sessions now, you're already kind of winning and you're already getting that attention. So if you're feeling creative, if you want to give it a try, I'm very happy to work with you on this, because I think it's something that could gain a lot of interest in your field. Okay. So I'm going to start wrapping things up. by just reminding you of some general resources if this kind of design is new to you. Don't feel like you have to do anything from scratch, that there are a lot of templates out there, including some from colleagues that you can likely ask for to get you started. PowerPoint is going to be your most accessible resource. It's the one that I think most people will choose to use the first time through unless they have a prior comfort with another software. It allows you to create a single slide that you save as a PDF. The nice thing about PowerPoint is that you do get a lot of freedom to put things where you want them without getting into the details of code and really complicated design strategies that other software provides. You just kind of put a text box where you want it, an image, a chart where you want it. Just keep in mind that you have to format the dimensions of your slide before you begin. Because when you try to change it up halfway through, which I have done, you're in for hours of trouble. So make sure that you're always setting those dimensions manually before you get started. There's some good online resources for this. I'm happy to pass these resources along that will help you just kind of go through the PowerPoint process and try and figure out where each thing is that you might want to get done. Your other choices are typically things like Illustrator or Inkscape. Those of you who like LaTeX will probably continue liking LaTeX for posters. And then Publisher is your other option. A lot of them, though, have a bit of buy-in. And so it's something that you would only invest the time in if you feel like it's a software you're going to utilize multiple times. Otherwise, PowerPoint is kind of your go-to. Most templates that are available online usually provide PowerPoint templates. So that's the one I recommend the most. Okay, as we wrap things up, I just wanted to remind you that the Writing Center is a really great resource for this process. We don't always think about posters when it comes to the Writing Center because we're usually bringing papers over there, but our tutors, our consultants are highly trained in poster kind of discussion and communication as well. So if you feel like you're really getting stuck and need an outside set of eyes to take a look at what you're doing and the ideas you're putting together, please come and see us. We're happy to talk through it. We offer up to full-hour appointments for graduate students if you're interested, and it's free. So instead of bugging all of your colleagues all the time, we're happy to take a look at what you're looking at. So our information is there, but you can easily find us on our Writing Center website and make appointments ahead of time. With that, we've kind of just barely scratched the surface of good poster sessions. I think they are a medium that deserves more attention than they get sometimes. And so I really hope that as you are preparing for your own, you'll find them to be effective at getting people interested in your ideas. I'm always happy to personally work with people on poster design because I know it varies person to person and topic to topic in terms of figuring out what you have to do. So chat with me. I'm more than happy to kind of see what you're working on. But thank you for coming and for listening today. I appreciate it.
Okay, quick announcement before we go. Just a reminder that tomorrow is From Stress to Success panel from 2 to 3 in the Leadership Studies Hall. Also, don't forget to fill out the survey if you want credit for the professional development certificate, and that will be emailed to you within 24 hours. Okay, thank y'all.